So, I mean, have the folks that have been calling, are they worried about their daily or are
The,
they worried
the
about their track car?
It's not a huge sample set, but I would say that of the people that called based on or reacted after the first video, it was people that had not tracked their cars yet. They wanted to track their cars, but now they were concerned that now they had to do all of this additional work before they could safely track their car the first time. That was by and large, I'd say probably the 5 or 7 calls that we got after that first video.
Hmm.
Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. This show is brought to you by Flatirons Tuning, your source for any aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts. Be sure to check out our store at flatironstuning.com and stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.
Oh,
Ramon.
Ramon, he's back.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. All right. Well,
all right, John.
Sorry for
Kick
the
it
delay.
off, buddy.
Let's dive into this. So this is going to be episode number 102 of the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. We got Dussex and Tasso joining us, and we are back. We have to talk about Donut Media again because holy smokes, we were saying before that there's now a black hole shortage of EJ engines because they're all going to Donut Media. They're just soaking up all of the short blocks, creating a worldwide shortage because they are just having all sorts of trouble. And man, we were getting calls when they had the first one, and now they've gone through like I think they're by my tally
4 or
4
5.
engines.
Mm-hmm.
Should we do like a clickbait warning and also do like a clickbait title and a clickbait like everyone like
what's the clickbait
right
title
now and like so we can have an angry screen grab. So Ryan
damn
make
you
an angry
Donut
face
Media
too.
yeah
So okay, and then it'll be like, what's wrong with Donut Media or something like that.
Yeah,
and then we'll talk about real stuff.
I was toying with the idea of the title being Subaru 4 Donut Media 0. I don't know.
I don't know.
It's the thing.
I think it's more than 4, right?
Well, by my tally, it's 4. They keep saying 5, so maybe there's another failure that they haven't documented.
So they have the first car engine, right? That one died. That
Okay.
was in the high car.
Yes.
Right, and then they put the second engine in, and then James spun it out and wrecked it, kind of.
And the engine failed in the crash. Also in the high car.
Crash.
Yep.
And then they put the third engine. Oh, so yeah, you're right. It is 4. So then they put the third engine in, and then when they did the turbos,
they got a new
both
car.
Low car and
they got a new car.
Yeah.
So
when they put the third engine, when they put the turbos on, they like saw oil or metal in both
cars,
the oil pans. So like low car and high car. Well, new high car got new engines.
Yep. So yeah, that's what I've got it. And apparently, I mean, I don't know if they're done now, but I mean, yeah, brutal.
Well, they want to do more. I mean, there's definitely more video in the series because they're throwing up teasers with string, like arrow strings and stuff on the cars.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So there's definitely more.
Yeah. Well, and the reason that I wanted to talk about it is because when they had the first one, they were really kind of throwing Subaru under the bus, and they have continued to drive that bus with all the other issues and frustration that they've had. And I can only imagine what now the general opinion is out there because of what they're talking about. But what's crazy, as we're recording this, I looked this morning. We were looking at these videos a minute ago. They're both at 1.9 million views, and both of those last 2 videos, the brakes and the turbo, came out within the last 7 days. So,
which brings up the main thing I want to talk about. If they're getting 1.9 million views, why isn't the motorsports industry swimming in like mainstream sports levels of sponsorship dollars? That's what I want to talk about here.
Okay.
Because it's the game, right? And that's the stance I'll take on Donut Media. They're really good at what they do, and this is the game. Don't hate the player, hate the game.
Yeah.
They're killing it with their content. I think they make good content, and this is it. Like that's just what the content. This is what gets views, and views is currency, right?
Yep.
But if they're getting millions and millions of views per video, and not just them, right? You look at a lot of the really successful YouTube channels. They're getting huge amounts of viewership. So where is the coffers of gold bars just falling on all of us motorsports people?
Well, because the motorsports is not getting the views is the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. People like watching the calamity and chaos. You know, I mean,
Well,
just I feel like just people talking about the engines failing, people want to see the engines failing, right?
myself, like I watched the subsequent two videos on that series because like, all right, are they going to have more failures? What's going on? You know, am I going to get more calls? What is the presentation that they're going to give of any subsequent issues that they might have? And so they got me that way. And I'm sure that there's tons of people out there that just want to see, like, are they having more trouble? What's going on? I mean, it's like I said, they're playing the game very effectively. And man,
I don't
YouTube.
think that there's really anything all that interesting about their failures, right? They're driving, non-motorsports components in abusive ways, and then whoa, Subarus are failing. Whoa.
Well, so
okay.
they got multiple views for me. And the second time I went through and paid close attention, there are some interesting details that are I think are well worth talking about, which is again one of the motivations to come back here and just kind of try and break down what we're seeing, what we know, what we don't know, all that sort of thing. But I mean, certainly there's a drama element.
They were all
certainly.
just oil starvation issues, right?
Well, probably.
Or funky tune issues, which I thought maybe, but that was hard to pin down because I didn't give enough detail.
I mean, those were assuming stock tunes, right? Like, or however
Probably.
they received the cars. One of them made 225 wheel, which I thought was crazy.
Yeah. So these are 06 WRXs. So this is the 2.5 liter, but with the TD04 turbo, a really small turbo. So like the new high car that they got, they're like, oh, it's down on power because it only makes 190. Like, that's probably more than I would say would be normal for that car stock. Unless they're trying to do some correction factor to get flywheel horsepower, then maybe. Because like when they put that turbo on the 2.5, and so those cars, the 0607, they were rated, I think, right around, like, I think it was 230 wheel horsepower, just like the 2-liter WRX that it replaced. They were not rated that high. The 2-liter WRXs, totally stock, dynoed between 165 and 175 at the wheels, in that range.
Yeah.
And I want to say that the 2.5 in WRXs in 06 to 07, they were right around that, like 170, 180. They were not, they made more torque, but they did not make more power. So
yeah, I remember the S stock STIs were doing like 215, 220 wheel. So I mean, that's assuming whatever they're on,
The Wednesday cars were like hitting 240 at the wheels. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, well, it seems, and I guess just to put a bow on it, the reason that I wanted to talk about is because they're really characterizing Subarus as being unreliable and prone to failure. And certainly with all the luck that they've had, you can see that, or you can see where they're saying that. But there's just more to it. There's more to this story. It's not that simple. And I would say that at this point, this is not a typical experience in a lot of ways. And I don't think it's indicative of an issue of just the engine in and of itself. In a lot of ways, what this is, I would say that this is normal of somebody that is into cars, working on cars, modifying cars, that comes into Subarus now cold, which, like, a handful of those guys have said they've never worked on a Subaru before. So they're coming into Subarus without a lot of background. And then in this case, throwing bolt-ons at the car, going for big power, having failures because you're making some, miscalculations, you're putting on parts maybe in an order that is not advisable or something like that, then to have subsequent failures from that standpoint, that I say is a bit typical.
Yeah, the thing to take from their videos is not Subarus are unreliable. It's that you need to ask someone for advice when you don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
Which is fine. I mean, that's the same with anything, right? I could go make unreliable 4G63s and 2Js and Cumminses and whatever if I just went out and bolted some shit on and didn't know where they fail.
Yeah.
And right. It's not surprising to me, and
right.
And I don't think they're also putting them in that light. They're just capitalizing on a meme.
Well,
right?
no,
Like
they specifically say, I want to say when they get to the turbos that, Subarus are just unreliable. They're known for having all these problems and all that.
sure.
Yeah.
I mean,
But they're not going to give up.
It's just a meme,
That's
though,
right.
right? Like, I mean,
Probably, yeah.
it's just more popular. It's more popularly known than like the oil pump nut issue on BMW motors, like in the E36 era, right?
Yeah.
Like, go look that up if you want to talk about unreliable motors, or anything else. Look up the killer dowel pins on Cummins. Like every motor has a meme issue.
What was the Porsche issue with like the 996s,
The
ballast
IMS
shaft?
batteries.
Yeah.
Or like the New Balances, right?
Yeah, where the engines would just
shaft.
completely catastrophically fail randomly, but I think now they've kind of come out with
For LSs, it's 4L60s or lifter tick or all sorts of stuff, right? Like everything has a thing, and they're just raking in dollars on capitalizing on this one. So good for them.
Yep. Well, and it's one of these. I think like overall, the dream is that you have a car that you can take to the track, and it requires minimal effort and oversight to go to the track, drive around, have fun, and then come and drive home. Something, like you drive out to the track, you just beat on the car for a whole day at a track session, you drive it home, park it in your garage, and then you don't even think about the car again until you want to drive it, a month from then, and that's it. That's certainly the dream for many people. But I think reality, I mean, that's worth saying right off the bat, is that if you're going to be tracking your car, if you're going to be pushing the car, using it hard, like you should not expect that you will not have to like check anything, look at anything, do anything to the car. I mean, there are some cars out there where you could probably get away with that, if they're closer to stock, whatever. But
Volvos,
maybe, yeah. I mean,
Old
I'd say
Volvos.
some
Will's
Corvettes,
Volvos.
yeah, old Volvos, yeah, some Corvettes, but not all. Some Porsches, but not all. And I guess what I would say is that, like, just as a starting point, like you should, if you're going to be pushing your car, using the car hard, driving it hard, trying to get the maximum potential and performance out of the car, like you need to pay attention to the car. You need to pay attention to the tires, the brakes, the fluids, the car itself, for sure.
And the point there is driving is like maximum potential, right? Like you could take a car, detune it, give it really good cooling and oiling, put it on really bad tires, and you could totally do that. Show up, check nothing, go out, slide around for a few laps, drive home, put it away hot, start it cold.
Yeah.
But if you're, I mean, that's assuming that you're, asking nothing of overbuilt components. And
Right.
that's like my recipe for Subaru reliability is I build a motor with components for whatever stage 69 power, and I run it at stage 3 power levels, or I build it for hundreds and hundreds of horsepower and I run it at about 400. And so I've spent more time on rev limiter than those donut motors are at idle. And my motors are sloppy.
Well, and you have been on the platform for a while. You've had failures. You've dealt and worked through known issues. Yeah. So you know what to look for, what to pay attention to, and where there is a solution for a problem that you've had, then you've put that solution in place. You've tested the solution. Like I'm thinking of here, like your catch cans. And then you okay, well, you're using catch cans, roughly how much oil moves through the PCV system that the catch cans are going to take, how long your event runs are and how much maintenance and attention those catch cans are going to require through the course of a weekend. And that's what keeps the car reliable, because you've worked through the problem, what to pay attention to and what you have to do to keep the car running properly as you're using it.
And this is my secret recipe to success right here, and anyone can take this or whatever, is don't just slap together decent components. Get good components that are addressed holistically, right? So think about the motor as a whole when you put it together. Don't just be like, this piston will make me safe at 400 horsepower. No, make a motor that's good for that. Address the thing holistically, pay for good machining. If you can't assemble it, if you're not sure when the last time your torque wrenches were calibrated, don't assemble your motor. Have a buddy do it, or and then just don't be surprised when your ship blows up, which is kind of my plan.
Right.
and then pay for a tune. You don't know tuning. I mean, tuning is not a black magic, but it is an art, and there are better artists than me, which is why I pay for a tune.
Yeah. Well, and once they put the turbos on, they actually work with Yimi Sport to tune the cars. And Yimi Sport, they know what they're doing. They've been in Subarus forever. That is a solid shop and tuner. So
right.
I mean,
that's who tuned all of Jaeger's cars, right?
Maybe. Yeah, I know that there was a Yimi Sport car that was running in Time Attack for a while. I just don't remember the name.
They had a couple. They had like Civics and stuff, but pretty sure that was who dealt with Jaeger's cars.
Okay. Yeah. They've been in the game for a long time, and it's one of those, maybe that's another takeaway, is like, if there's a Subaru shop that's been in the game for a long time, well, that's the value of working with a shop like that, working with a team like that, a tuner like that, where they've got a lot of experience that they can bring to the car. So you're coming into it fresh. You maybe don't know things to look at, the problems that you might have, that sort of thing. But these guys, can point you in the right direction. That's what we all here do. To anybody that comes up to us, like that's bringing their car out to the track for the first time, or is having a problem, whatever, and we'll do the best to let our experience shed some light on what might be going on. So that's where the value in that comes in. And they're kind of, I guess I would say more than anything, they're showcasing the value of working with a Subaru shop, a Subaru tuner that is familiar with the platform, knows what works, knows what doesn't, has a lot of tried, tested, and true experience. That's the value in that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. I'm curious to see how their engine failures, if they go away after this most recent batch, because they had that other shop too. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it's the shop that Amelia Hartford used to take to her cars to, for Subarus too.
Like Subi Dreams or something?
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
It looks similar. I mean, that's been so long since I watched it, but so she, so they did all the assembly and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Brought in, I'm guessing, fresh short blocks is what it sounded like. Nothing crazy, not like IAG Extreme .69 or anything like that. But they put it together, and then Yimi Sport tuned it. Mm-hmm. I'm curious to see if their engine failures go away. Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. So, all right. So there's a couple interesting details that I noticed watching the turbo video, where basically they had brought the cars in from running them at the track with the brake test, and then found that there's bearing material in both of them, the new high car and the low car. The first interesting detail, did you notice that they couldn't get the headers to fit?
Yeah. Did you notice the oil pan that they were running to?
I did. I want to get to that, but I want to talk about why the headers don't fit first, which is, so the 0607 WRXs, they've got the little wedge between the oil cooler and the block, which kicks the filter out at an angle. So equal length and unequal length headers do not fit. You have to remove that wedge oil cooler and either, ideally what you do is convert to an STI oil cooler, which basically just has the filter come straight down, then it will clear the headers. But what's interesting to me is, they went and they built these engines, and especially on the high car, they rebuilt the engine, but they still have that oil cooler on there. And if you're going to put on headers, and because it could just be an accident, but it really makes me wonder if they reused the oil cooler in the process of going through these engines, because it's not that much money, but is a sort of expensive part. And if you're going to pay money for that, why wouldn't you get the oil cooler that's going to work with the headers that you're going to do in the next iteration?
Right.
So it makes me wonder if they just reuse the oil cooler, which, that's one of these known issues. If you reuse the oil cooler, it can trap bearing material in the oil cooler, and it can move it into the new engine, cause an immediate failure of a new engine. And that got me to question, well, if they did reuse that, what else did they reuse? Because
gears, solenoids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
those stupid filtered turbo oil lines,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I'm not saying that they did, but it just makes me wonder. And if they did reuse components, that's one of the things that we've said and learned years ago, is that if you have a bearing failure, anything that oil touches, you have to be able to be 100% confident that you've cleaned it out so that there's no metal contamination that you're moving into the new engine, or you have to replace it. There's just really no ifs, ands, or buts about that. And
if I can't if I can't visualize all the nooks and crannies, then I don't reuse that part.
Yeah.
So coolers, pans that don't have removable baffling, solenoids, all that stuff. I'll reuse like the hard oil lines on the heads, right?
Sure.
Because I can blow those out, and I'm pretty sure that's all relatively smooth surface in there.
It's a straight tube. Yeah.
Anything a thing can be trapped, don't reuse it. If you have circulated, non-squishy material. So.
Yeah. But so the pans were really interesting. So Dussex, what pans do they have on the car?
Those IAG competition pans.
Yeah, and so this
they had them on there before they had them on there
were doing
when they were seeing exactly when they're seeing the metal in the pans. They had the IAG pans already.
Now the IAG pan is a good pan. I would not hesitate to put that on my car if it would fit with everything else that I'm using. But that was super interesting, and it's worth mentioning because I think like that's another trap that we can fall into, right? Is you think that, okay, well, there's this problem with like the pans or the pickup or whatever. And so if I'm going to put on this pan, well, that fixes the problem. And then I think that's a trap that we can fall into, because then you don't pay attention as much to the oiling system or oiling that is used or oil that is used on track or anything like that.
The IAG pan, is it like just a baffle insert? Or is it a full?
It's pretty wild, man. It's like so basically like it's a big deep sump pan, and then they've got basically like a 4-walled like a trap with little rubber trap doors that go around in the sump. I mean, it's
in the sides and from the top.
I would say it's like I would say it's one of the most elaborate pans out there for sure. Like as far as the wet sump pan goes, I'd say it's like the most elaborate pan out there.
It has extra volume and a lot of aggressive baffling, and it's their pickup that it comes with and works with. And I mean, there's a couple of the people that we talked to were just like, man, I feel like I need to put like an IAG oil pan on my car if I'm from day one, if I'm going to take it to the track. And it's not a bad idea. It's not a bad thing. There's a lot of work involved to putting a pan on. But like we talked about last time, Dussex, you're still using the stock pan on the yellow car for all of this time, just with a little change to the pickup, the Roger Clark anti-surge
damper.
Yeah.
And
so that's
you're
the
having
thing.
plenty good issue. Yeah.
Like I don't want an IAG bash or RCM fanboy. And full disclosure, supported by RCM. So, take whatever I'm about to say for what it's worth. But RCM does have that motorsports history and that access to pro drive information that IAG doesn't have, right? And so that's, for people that don't know, the Subaru WRC cars back in the day were wet sump.
Yeah.
And they saw way more G-force than this, that, or whatever random shit. And they had, motorsports factory level backing of R&D into them, stuff like that. So, I've never had, unless I really create a stupid situation, I've never had an oiling issue with just the RCM group end pan and their castellated pickup thing. So, well, so I don't know what IAG's background is of research on there. I mean, even down to like the formula for the rubber in those flaps makes a big difference on how it behaves in heat and how it behaves in, if it gets too soft and it just flaps out of the way, then you're not doing anything.
I'm pretty sure that everybody's using Viton for those flaps, which is Cosworth was one of the first to do it, and they probably started doing it because they were aware of what ProDrive was doing. I mean, so I think that the flaps are probably solid across the board with, between IAG, Killer Bee, Roger Clark. If you're using still the Cosworth pan that has the Viton flaps in it, I think there's a lot of consistency for the most part. If it's not one of those brands and they make something, I would be a little bit more suspicious of the flaps that they're using. And
so IAG, has the money right now to, buy the information on this, a lot of this kind of stuff. So I'm not saying
they do have their own test wheel cars though. They had all the stuff with Sally and Marcos's car. They got Dan Kroll's car, which is probably one of the higher horsepower US.
It's dry sump now. I think it's been
now.
recent for a while, but like Devin Alexandra.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I haven't actually paid attention, but I think that might be still running their pan.
Yeah, she is for sure.
Street tires and stuff.
She is
the 200 treadwear cheaters. So it's like
she's on AL52s.
Yeah, a sticky 200.
I don't know. Like I said before,
that being
a million
said, at
times,
least they have that. It's not like they're aimlessly making. Like, think about all the cars. She's going to throw Torque Solutions out there. Think about all their shop cars and how many they have, how many you see at any given track weekend. I don't think there is any, and so at least IAG has that, I'll give them that.
Well, and ultimately, I think what it comes down to is like you can't assume that you put a part on or a couple of parts on that are designed to solve a problem, and then you no longer have to pay attention to that problem.
Right.
Like you
Plus, it has to be assembled right too. I mean, I don't know what the IAG pan looks like. I guess I do because I did do trays. But one of the things I noticed when I was working on a Killer B pan is I had that spacer, and the spacer inside the pan gets the pickup closer to the bottom of the pan.
Yeah.
And to me, when I see it, it's such like an oversight kind of thing. I just can't remember if that's how the IAG pan was or not, where you've got like basically the factory O-ring location, a spacer drops into it, another O-ring, and then and then where the sump actually picks up, and then where the stands are also spacers that have to be indexed correctly, to sit where it's supposed to be. And so like I see those as potential installation error issues. You know what I'm saying?
So what we're talking about here, so the IG pan, it's a deeper pan. So that's how they're getting the extra volume, is the bottom is lower. So you have to take the pickup, because they use the standard pickup for a standard pan, but then they include spacers to move it lower in their pan because it can be, but then you have to space it down that way. You have to basically space it lower so that it's still picking up from the bottom. I think if it was higher, it wouldn't be that bad, but it would make it a lot easier for it to starve of oil if there's oil movement, oil sloshing.
Right. And I mean, my point is like even the most well-engineered piece, whether it's from Roger Clark, IAG, or Killer B, I mean, you still have, and I'm sure this is an issue that they deal with, each one of those companies deal with too, you still have the installation error potential. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's no mystery that the stock pickup doesn't even go to the bottom of the pan. For whatever reason, Subaru did that. Maybe if there's a rock hit or whatever their motivation was. I mean, that's why Roger Clark built that castellated little, damper, so it does bring it all the way to the bottom of the pan. You think of like or you look at the pad design, like a 2-liter pan versus the STI pan. The STI pan has a much smaller footprint. So like a quart of oil and a smaller footprint sits a lot higher than a quart of oil with a pan that's got a much larger footprint. So, I mean, there's enough of these variables that are happening that like 1 or 2 or 3 little things can really compound into major issues.
Yeah.
Which is my earlier point about building a motor holistically, right?
Yeah.
Like a cooling, like addressing cooling for your motor is not just putting a radiator on it. Addressing oiling for your motor is not just putting a pan on it. It's like the whole thing has to work together. And like I didn't mean to be negative IAG with my comment, but the more variables you introduce, the less surprised you should be when you can't address all the variables. And so I don't know what, brand XYZ's testing process is, and on their testing process, what other components they were using in order to make the whole thing test to whatever level they wanted it to test to before releasing it, right? So
well, and something as simple with that pan, which we've had calls about where people get it's like any of these larger volume pans. How do you know when it's full? Because the pan is deeper, you have more capacity, so you've got to put in more than just like the 4.3, 4.5, maybe 5 quarts of oil. But how do you know where it's full? Like, is it just the full mark on the dipstick? Do you have to kind of keep track of how much oil you're adding? Like, I want to say with like Killer B and the IG, I think it's somewhere around 6 quarts. So you just straight add 6 quarts in, and then that's where like do you basically put a new full mark on?
You should do a what's your question Wednesday or whatever it is based on reading your dipstick on your Subaru.
Right. It's not as easy as you might think sometimes.
There's a lot more going on there than the,
right.
just looking at some oil on a stick.
Sure. Because like even with the larger volume pan, if you put the larger volume pan on, but then now because it's a larger volume pan, you don't put the right amount of oil into it, now you're going to be leaving yourself more vulnerable for a problem of oil starvation due to low oil volume in the pan because it wasn't, you didn't fill it quite right necessarily. And with Subarus, there's the whole running it race full with a stock pan, which, the idea is race full, which is basically on an STI pan, putting a full 5 quarts into it, which with the car just sitting, now the oil is going to be up into the girdle of the engine. But you start the engine and the engine is running and you've got the delay of the oil coming back from the heads, and all of a sudden there's a school of thought out there that overfilling the pan as the car sits stationary without the engine running actually gives you a better, more consistent oil level once the car is running and you're driving around the track at speed and you've got oil movement, all that sort of jazz.
Okay.
So then what happens when you put a bigger pan on there?
When I check oil level, car running, pull dipstick, turn car off, dip, pull out before the oil has time to drain back from everything else, because that gives me a non-sloshing, non-vibrating, idea of what the actual running level of oil is in the car. And I know I'm probably silly about that, and it's also not the correct procedure per Subaru and all these kind of things like that. But it's a system that I found works for me because I want to know, I can keep an eye on putting more and more oil in there until it aerates from, being splashed. Or there's so many things that affect how much oil is actually in the pan of a car. That's what I found gives me the most accurate sense of, what I actually have sitting in the reservoir, which is the pan.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess the long and short of it is there's definitely some subtleties to it, and experience pays, dividends here when you know what, even just how to read the dipstick and how to fill up the sump. I mean, it's not necessarily as clear cut and straightforward as you might think of just like, go to the full on the dipstick. There's a little bit more going on there. And the more you become familiar with the car, the more you use the car, the more you know these details. And maybe this is one of those things that they were missing out on. There's one other. Go ahead.
When they said that they were baffled by just the orientation of all the parts in the engine bay, I thought to myself, well, there's your problem.
Could be.
They're just completely unfamiliar with the platform, which is fine. And that's, everyone starts at the same place. But, I think that there's a big root of an issue there. Is just,
could be.
If I was driving a grand piano and it became out of tune, no one would say grand pianos are always out of tune. They would say this guy doesn't know how to drive a piano. And I think
or this guy doesn't know not to drive a piano,
or doesn't know how to make a good analogy, maybe.
Sure.
Well,
it's like, if I somehow won the lottery and I got a 911 Turbo that I decided I wanted to track, I would do a lot of digging.
That's your lottery car?
Geez, at this point, they're getting up there.
The lottery needs to be higher, I think, is what we're saying.
I don't, scratch ticket, whatever. I don't.
Okay.
I don't know. But the point being is, I would talk to a lot of people. I would reach out. I would ask a lot of questions. And the first time I go to the track, I would probably take it pretty easy. I would kind of build up that familiarity with the car before I would just go out there and just push it. Because having had issues in the past and having worked through issues on the Pikes Peak car and stuff like that, it's like, okay, I want to take this a step at a time. I want to go gradually just to make sure that I am comfortable, that the car is working right, that I'm working right, that I'm paying attention to the things that I need to pay attention to, versus just go out there and okay, let's put down a flyer and let's do that for the next 45 minutes and just see what happens.
Sure. Yeah. The last thing I'll say, because I'm tired of even hearing myself talk about it, is another thing to keep perspective on here is I have a handful of acquaintances that are in the hypercar maintenance industry. They have, hypercar specialty shops, whether that be McLaren's or, whatever, super rare Ferrari, stuff like that. And the amount of stuff that they talk about, you would think that these cars are super unreliable as well. because it's like, oh yeah, some rich guy just brought in his whatever and he ran it out of oil and now he's wondering why it's rod knocking. It's like, yeah, everything, you run a Formula One car out of oil, it's going to have a problem. You run a World Endurance Championship car out of oil, it's going to have a problem. You neglect maintenance and you're not familiar with the platform or what its telltales are, then you're going to have a problem. And it's across every industry.
Yeah.
That's just that, Subaru industry is very social media active versus
they've gotten a reputation, and Donut Media's experience is kind of going into that. It's like it's catering to that reputation, and they are not hesitating to emphasize, Subarus are unreliable. These things are, they're not good cars or whatever. And it's way more. There's way more to it than that. And if you know what you're doing, they can be reliable. And I mean, right. Dussex, you've proven it. Tasso, I mean, you've gotten multiple race seasons out of an engine. I mean, you've proven it. I mean, I think we've had decent luck. So, I mean, they can be reliable. It's just, again, it's like you have an issue and you work through that issue. There's a reason we put a dry sump on the Pikes Peak car, because I know that there are oiling issues and there are issues with the PCV system. Those two are related. They are not exclusive at all, but either one of those things can cause an issue where you lose, oil pressure or have a bearing failure. And that's where I think that, the best solution that I could find for our race car was to put a dry sump on it, so that we know that we have as good of oiling as possible. And
I'd love to run a dry sump just for the PCV benefits. Like I don't really need it for the oil control issue so much as,
honestly.
And I'd love to run that crankcase under vacuum.
What's funny is there's this new wave of people that are saying that dry sumps aren't worth it. They're not worth the cost, and they're not worth the complexity. And I can see where it's coming from to an extent, but yeah, they're completely missing the whole thing about the PCV system and how it basically completely resolves those issues, because the PCV system is removed. Now, plumbing the dry sump right, there's a lot to it. We've done a video or a couple of videos on what our solutions were for that. Once we've got to that point, holy cow, it's so much simpler, so much easier, and so much more reliable. But it took us time to get there. And it's taken a lot of other people time to get there. But yeah, being able to just basically remove any of the issues you have with the PCV system, that in and of itself it speaks to the value of running a dry sump. Yeah. The one last point I want to make on this, because we have we've hit on a lot of points here, but the other thing I want to say is, like, when they got the new high car and they were doing the brake test and they said, something's not right. This car seems to be way down on power. It's like 4 seconds slower than it really should be. Well, we're just going to keep on driving it. And then they're like, it seems to have worked out its issues. Like, man, that's another thing. Like when you're going to the track, if you have an issue, if you see a problem, most of the time, one of the best things you can do if you see a problem, have an issue, whatever, is stop driving the car. I mean, it stinks to go out and do one lap, 120-minute session, whatever, 2 sessions, and have paid the entry fee to go out there and do it. But I'll tell you, if you see a problem that's happening and you drive the car home, put the car back on the trailer and take it home and figure out what that problem is and fix it, it might not be fun on the day of, but man, that's a way better solution most times than trying to drive through the problem or whatever, because that usually never ends well.
I was just joking about that yesterday with some rally dudes about how we've never had small engine failures because they only ever happen during competition, and when you're all red misted up and stuff like that, and you're like, what's that noise? I can't hear it. Whoop. And then boom, and then whatever. Yeah.
And it's, I mean, from their standpoint, like, just to even take it from like a higher level, they've rented out Willow Springs. They're paying to rent out a whole track. They're not paying for a like one car slot on a track day. They're renting out the whole track to go out there and shoot these videos. I mean, I'm sure that they have a decent budget, but like, man, if you go out to do a whole day of shooting, and they have crew, they have camera, like there's a big expense to go out to a track for a day and rent the whole track. And you go out there and you have a problem. It's like, that's a big thing to say, like, nope, we need to go back to the drawing board or go back through the car before we push it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's no joke. I mean, there's probably spending significantly more than my annual budget for racing just to make a 20-minute video.
Yeah.
Significantly more.
Yeah.
And, you know.
Yeah. So
that's why they're getting those millions of clicks.
Right.
Just saying.
Well, and to a certain extent, like, I mean, like to defend their standpoint, like if they have a failure, I mean, the one where they say, hey, we blew up our first engine, that was at 1.4 million views. These last two videos are 1.9. I mean, it's drama like this. I mean, that keeps people watching. So I mean, it could very well be that their priorities or their process in working through a day's shooting like this is way different than ours, than ours would be. You know,
our shooting,
yeah.
My day of media production.
Yeah.
So another thing I noticed too, I'm sorry, go ahead, Joe.
No, go ahead. No,
I noticed that both the cars had coil radiators on them when they were pulling the engines and step out. So it made me think about it, and I don't remember them talking about the cars overheating in the video, any of the videos about them having overheating issues. But when you have a big coil radiator on, which is sick, don't get me wrong, I like the brand a lot. It probably means they're also not watching what the oil temps are doing. So they're driving these cars back to back on a short track in the hot California, you know, at least late summer, early fall, I'm guessing at this point, right? And if you're not watching your oil temperatures and maybe they know they had cooling temperature problems already, so they're trying to control the coolant temperature with the big radiator, doesn't necessarily mean they fix all those issues, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that was another thing I noticed. So if they're running the water to air or the water to oil or exchangers, that could be what's driving, those temperatures could be what we're driving up the coolant temperatures in the first place. And then rather than be like, oh shit, why is it doing it? They said, oh, you know what? Every track car should have a big radiator. So you put the big radiator on it, and then simply just a water to oil exchanger isn't usually enough for a track day car. In my opinion.
You're talking about the factory oil cooler.
Right, exactly.
Right.
The factory oil cooler.
It depends. And considering that they were supposed to be stock, I think a stock car is fine. You know, when they're putting on the bigger turbo, then that gets to be a little bit more of a gray area. But I guess the point I would say, what I was really surprised by was seeing the IAG pans on both cars when they were putting the turbos on, because like if they're saying that these are stock cars, they're not. You know, you've gone in and you've done other modifications to them, but they're not detailing any of that as far as why. And I mean, there's a lot of good reasons why you could do that, but it's just, you know, somebody had pointed out that primarily Dunham Media is about entertainment, not information. And I think that kind of like to your point, there's questions, there's information that we're not getting, that we're not seeing. We're not getting a detailed walkthrough of everything that they find in each of these cars. And to a certain extent, like for us, that's what we would be interested in, but there's probably the populace at large that's not what they'd be interested in. Like that's what we do, and we get like a couple hundred views on a video, and they do something else, and they're getting millions of views. So, okay, maybe we have something we can learn from them for sure about like.
Well, it depends on what your goal is.
Videos. Yeah.
I mean, look at how much they simplify their up to speed videos, which are really good and entertaining, and I enjoy watching them. But they're like, especially the topics that I know a little bit more about, it occurs to me how much they simplify and how much they kind of cut those down to make for good entertainment, right? And because the lay person doesn't want to know, they don't care, it's boring, or frustrating to think about, which is you know why we're not millionaires right now. We talk about a lot of really boring stuff for a niche market.
And we do deep dives into stuff that it means a lot to us, but you know, just the public at large, not necessarily.
Ryan, you brought up a super amazing point though about they probably were having runaway oil temp issues, and it's a thing that skipped my mind in this conversation, but I thought before is like the first thing I think when someone's having overheating issues is that they're running that oil cooler and they have an oil system issue, like the factory oil cooler. Like you don't need a big radiator on one of these cars as long as you address the oiling cooling situation in addition to the control situation. I still run a stock radiator on my car, and it will overheat eventually, especially if I don't spray water on it. But I'm also making 400 horsepower at 105 degree heat, on the rev limiter for 5 minutes, right? So that's well beyond what these guys are doing in terms of asking for a load for their motor. And so it wouldn't surprise me. And then also, right, if they're just like, oh, it runs 5W30, that's what it says on the oil cap, bloop, 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 like slam that in there. And I wonder if they were logging oil pressures, if they wouldn't just be heat saturating that oil and turning it into, something oil gets really thin. I was going to say turning it into water in terms of viscosity. And I think a lot of oils are there, but you know what I'm trying to say? Like and that's why they have these global oiling issues like they had, where, every bearing in that motor was colored. Right.
So that's what and I'll put some of my own information out there too. I run like an old PWR radiator. It's really like a backup radiator. It had a hole in it like that was this big that's been patched. So it's not even the most effective radiator. But to like Tasso's point, you don't really need necessarily a giant radiator on a car, but it should match your whole cooling package should match your expectation. So when I could see my oil temps and I could see my coolant temps. My coolant temps won't ever get over 160 degrees on the track. But my oil temps will continue to climb and continue to climb. And I can have 160 degree coolant temps and 300 degree oil temps because I don't run an oil cooler either. And that'll happen like at PPIR where there's not a lot of wind movement. You're in a bowl. It's like 100 degrees outside. That'll happen in like 5 or 6 minutes, of on track time. So when I get to that, that 280, 270 range, I pull it back. And my coolant temps will still be 160 degrees and not budget, really good coolant temps. So if they're having, because that oil cooler will transfer heat into the cooling system, just like the cooling system will help pull some of the heat out of the oil system. You can keep the oil temps down, coolant temps down, because that's what you're focused on. And I've personally witnessed how much the oil temperatures can go up just with my own logging in like 5 or 6 minutes.
But what our experience has been with the factory oil cooler is that it does help to stabilize the oil temps. If you don't have like the 8 to 14 WX, when they took the oil cooler off the car, way easier to get really high oil temps on track really fast. Until we started putting oil coolers on the Pikes Peak car, we were like turning good synthetic oil black in like 2 20-minute sessions on track.
Right.
Because I can only imagine that we were getting up close to 280, 300 degrees in 20 minutes on track. Because
wild to me, you guys weren't running oil coolers.
Well,
not initially.
Them or me?
I mean, you just said you're running without one.
Yeah, and it was more of a cheap thing. Like with my oil fuel cell didn't put me in a position where I needed the temperature, where like my range of on-track experience did not necessarily exceed the thermal capacity of my oil. Does that make sense? So to me, it was like an unnecessary complexity to add with the factory twin scroll header, because my parent setup won't work with that. The only setup that I have that'll work is my Spec C setup, which we had capped off essentially from Superlap 2 years ago.
We tried to add an oil, twin scroll headers. So make it hard because you've got 2 pipes that come across and they're high, and so getting a sandwich adapter that can actually send an AN line out and not put the AN line on top of the headers is challenging. It turns out, and we melted 2 sets of oil cooler lines.
I'll sell you my secret for $1 billion on how to do that. For anyone listening, I'll tell you guys for free off camera. Okay. It's not even that hard. But no, I've gone to a lot of lengths because I want Spec C headers too. And so I wrap my headers. I don't have the factory whatever's on there, so they're double wrapped, and then I have an old turbo blanket that's also wire tied on there. And then I have the heat wrap on the oil cooler lines too. And the oil cooler lines do sit on that turbo blanket, but it's fine because there's a billion layers of insulation then at that point. I sneak my oil cooler lines out that way.
That was what we ended up doing, but the vibration of the engine vibrated through the blanket, the turbo blanket, and it started to rupture the line. And this is one of the mornings testing at Pikes Peak. We started to smell like smoke or something like that, or burning. And so we stopped. And then when we got back and took everything apart, what we realized is that we were like this close to having a major fire because that line had worn through and it was soaking. It was soaking the turbo blanket with oil on top of the header, and it was we were very close to having a very bad day.
Yep.
So, but there's other solutions out there, but yeah, I mean, we struggled through that, and then that's where we decided, well, this car doesn't drive very much, and if you're using a good quality oil, I mean, 300-degree oil temps is high for sure. But I mean, for like modern direct injected cars, it's not that unusual.
Right.
Not to say that it's great, but like it certainly can happen.
Those cars have, do the 06 and up have the EGR coolers on them? That's just the FAs, right? The WRXs?
That's just the FA. Yeah.
Man, talk about high coolant temps or high oil temps and high intake air temps.
Yeah, you're sending hot exhaust gas into the cylinder heads. So you're heating everything up like crazy.
Yeah. They had an air pump, but it was other
for
air.
Cool, for
cool air for startup.
Starting,
right.
Emissions.
Yeah.
What?
So that's another thing.
Yeah. So this is taking another ridiculously complex topic and boiling it down to one data point. But I also run a 10W60 oil in my application, and an oil cooler that is about 3 times the size as most of those off-the-shelf oil cooler kits, with big, I forget what I'm on, like -10 lines or something like that. For
probably.
it. So
5/8 lines.
Yeah. So right, there's there's a more than an extra quart just in the lines and the cooler itself. And coming back, probably 1.5 quarts in that setup in my application, and my oil gets hot, right? But I'm on that stock radiator. I see for a coolant temp on like the hottest, crummiest, hardest days at Land's End and Grand Junction, where I'm not exaggerating, it is 105 degrees in the shade. I'll get up to 210, 220 for a coolant temp, but the coolant system, as much as I can, is separated like as far as I can from the oil system. In that big cooler, I'll spray it, and it gets hot. My idle oil pressures come down to 60 psi or something like that, even with my big ass oil clearances. But running that, that super heavyweight oil and a really big pump and a really big cooler, and it's too much to put into like a snippet of conversation how many dynamics go in there, but there are a bunch of really important things to keeping that motor alive and lubricated and cool.
And that's exactly what we were talking about getting experience, getting familiar with the car and the system, knowing what some of the problems are, and working through those problems. Okay, if oil temps are a problem or overheating is a problem, if you want to make sure that you've got the most robust cooling system on the car possible, you address the coolant side and the oil side of the cooling, and you build up both of those systems to make sure that under the hard use that you're putting the car through, that your temperatures for coolant and for oil are both going to be in your acceptable range. And to a certain extent, the experience of running the car is what will dictate or will inform you of what that acceptable range is. Because like Dussex, if you're getting up to like 260, 280 degrees in oil temps, there's a lot of people that would say that that's way too high. But if you've done it and you know that, okay, well, if I change my oil frequently, I use good quality fluid, and I keep an eye on things, that that it does work, or you can get away with it for some window of time. And so then you know what that is, and you pay attention to it, and you take the steps that you need to take to keep the oiling system functioning properly in that condition.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, and it's just like you were saying before, monitoring and staying on top of like we talked about before, baselines and stuff like that. I change my oil after every event. I run high quality oil. I mean, all those things, like if there was ever a moment where I was getting excessive metal, and I was doing 300-degree oil temps, I would definitely understand that was the correlation. Or the time that somebody misshipped, or the time that this happened, I think the bottom line is it's easy to boil down the oh man, Subarus are just shit. Don't track those cars, save yourself the trouble and avoid them, and go and run a Miata, which is probably what anybody getting into motorsports should probably do anyway. Miatas are way cheaper and way simpler, and I'm not going to say more rewarding, but they're just a different experience. But
that's the frustration that I have with the way that they're characterizing these failures. Is they're really blaming Subarus for everything, and they're not talking about what their role in these issues could be.
So without giving away, or go ahead, Ryan.
I was going to say, I wonder if that shop that put their engines together has a YouTube channel, and if they got any videos on the assembly and what they did. It'd be interesting to see. Or I'm sure they have an opinion on it too.
Yeah.
They've got assholes, right?
Well, probably.
So they definitely have an opinion.
They probably have an opinion.
No, we got the asshole market locked up over here.
Oh man.
Ooh. Without giving away like proprietary business information or something like that, like what effect have the videos had on Flatirons tuning?
Well, nothing direct, and it's a lot of ways it's too soon. Other than people are calling, so that's why I wanted to address the first one, because we started getting calls of people that were like really concerned, or they were asking like, do I have to put on an IAG or a Killer B pan on my car if I've never taken the car to the track before? Do I have to start taking these big steps just to take the car to the track the first time, because they were really concerned about the reliability? And I mean, if people have these cars and they want to use them and want to have fun with them, I mean, the concern that I have is that I want to make sure that people have a realistic view of all the stuff that we've talked about. Like, what do you have to pay attention to? What do you have to do? What do you not have to do to be able to take the car to the track and enjoy the car and have fun with it? And that's the impact to this point, is that it really was clear that there was a lot of people that their concern meter had been shot through the roof because of the first characterization of the failure. And I can only imagine, these have only been out for like, I think 7 days as we're recording this. But I can only imagine what more calls or to the point where, like, man, if they've been through 3 engines, I'm not even like, it's not even going to generate a call. People are just going to put up their hands and just go, I'm not doing it. It's not worth it. And it's like, and I can't fault anybody if that's their takeaway from it, but it's just, I wanted to kind of give a more detailed and, like, to whatever degree I can offer it, and we can offer it, a more expert opinion on what might be going on, what we're seeing, what we might not be seeing. How indicative of this is what you could expect if you take your car to the track the first time. And have I seen it happen a time or two? Sure. Is this what happens every single time? Not at all. But it's that problem where people that have an issue are very vocal about the issue. People that don't have the issue, like if somebody drives to the track and comes home and everything went well, like, not very many people have put out a video like, went to the track again, no major issues, it was fun, and that's it. Not as often as maybe we should.
Yeah, and it's and I'd be curious, like, for the people that are calling too, if it's a motorsports application or a daily driver application for them, because obviously we're motorsports people and all this kind of stuff, but with 30 million people in Colorado and 20 million of them are driving a Subaru.
25 million. I think that's more
whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And so whatever, there's 20 million Subarus cruising around Colorado, and 19,999,995 barely even have oil in them, and they're still going skiing every weekend and stuff like that, right? So it's, for a daily driver Subaru, folks got to remember, just keep a high quality oil in it and do your maintenance intervals and enjoy your life. You're golden, right? So it's, and when we talk about these concerns or having to address these problems, we're talking about a motorsports application, which is not a spirited on-ramp or going canyon carving or something like that. So I think that's so I mean, have the folks that have been calling, are they worried about their daily, or are they worried about their track car?
It's not a huge sample set, but I would say that of the people that called based on or reacted after the first video, it was people that had not tracked their cars yet. They wanted to track their cars, but now they were concerned that now they had to do all of this additional work before they could safely track their car the first time. That was by and large, I'd say probably the 5 or 7 calls that we got after that first video.
Okay.
And to be fair, it's like, if you've tracked your car once or twice or a handful of times and you've come home and you didn't have this happen, then the story that they're playing out doesn't hit home as much because your experience runs counter to what their narrative is already. So it's the people they're kind of thinking about going in this direction, wanting to go in this direction, but haven't yet, that they're kind of walking, they know that they're walking into some unknowns. And so now that's where they're wanting to address some of these, problems or issues before that first track day.
Yeah. And so you're telling them just 2J swap it and never look back?
Yep.
LS.
And you have to
LS.
overnight parts from Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, it's all about K swaps these days. The K swap is the new LS swap.
So what the hell is a K motor?
It's out of a Honda.
Yeah,
It's out of
I don't know
a
that much,
bunch
but
of
I don't know anything beyond that other than they're popular right now.
it's what replaced the B series. There was in the Integra and the Civic. So it's like the Civic Si from 2006.
8, I think it was the first year they did it. Well, anyway, that generation was 2006.
And like the
So the little inline fours.
Yeah.
RSX,
TSX,
Civic Si, TSX, CRVs, Elements,
Element, Accord. Yeah.
Accord.
Are they popular because they're everywhere, or are they popular because they're good?
They're popular because they're good.
And they're cheap because they're everywhere. Does that make sense?
They're cheap. They're cheap now. There's a long time where they were not. Like it was like
when they first came out.
They tried to make it next to impossible to swap that engine into anything else because of the ECU and making a lot of stuff hard to get. But now that there's enough cars that you can get that had those engines, they're relatively available. And it's something where, like, man, Viet would be the guy to talk to about this, but like it was a huge step up from the B series. Like the B series was good, but then the K series was like a big step up. It was so much easier to make power compared to the B series equivalent.
I love the B series, man. But there's a lot of other improvements too, though. Like one of the big improvements was the movement from a timing belt to a timing chain. Yeah. So like the K series are on timing chains, or the B series are belts. Yeah. I mean, they're rotated. They're just run a different way. I mean, everything about them is really different. And the bottom ends are they're all kind of plug and play. So you like heads on top of blocks. I mean, just like the B series stuff, but probably even easier. But I mean, you're not going to throw in like a Honda Element K in your car and start shitting on everybody else. Like they need the Element, all those base level K24s are like in your Element, in your CRVs. I mean, nobody wants them, and then the K20s that were like in your base model RSX or whatever, nobody wants those either. So really still, even in the K series hierarchy, people want still very specific engines and very specific heads and very specific combinations.
Yeah, the heads are the key part. You need the dual. Is it dual VTEC head? Like, so it's intake. I mean,
they have the I VTEC, and then there's even you can literally swap like the intake gear over, so where you get like 50 degrees of duration change instead of like the standard 20 or whatever. I don't know. I mean, I'm sure Viet would know, but just to put in perspective, like one of the better K24s you can buy out of a Euro R TSX, Nick Stenford just bought one for like 1,100 shipped, with the big valves, with the 50 degree cam sweep, with the 2.4 liter, I mean, so like ultimately they're relatively inexpensive.
Well, and
are there any like factory boosted applications?
Yeah, the one
RDX?
engine that was in the RDX Turbo, it's a 2.3 liter, but they have a bell housing that's more similar to the J series, the V6 engines. So like those engines don't ever really end up in anything because they were all-wheel drive and had that funky bell housing, but they're like factory forged cranks. I mean, most cars have forged cranks, but forged cranks, forged rods, forged pistons. I mean, they were pretty robust engines, but almost nobody uses them. But now you've got the Civic Type R engine, right? And those are very similar and have kind of you can't really mix and match a lot of the bits. But as far as like if you were going to put an engine in your S2000, you could almost as easily, outside of the cost, put a Civic Type R engine in it as easy as you could put in like a Euro TSX engine. There's direct injection and all that other crap, but mechanically,
And the aftermarket support for the K series, like, when we were talking to Amir and he's like, yeah, I built my K series to make 650 horsepower, and they're like, that's it. Like there's so many prescribed paths now to make really good power with the K series engine compared to a lot of other engines out there that, and just how readily available those engines are as a starting point. I mean, that's where I think they become so popular.
Yeah, they've got good flow through the heads. I mean, they've got so they're good in normally aspirated applications, and they're pretty robust bottom ends. So from the factory, they can handle a decent amount of power. I would say probably arguably as much or more power than like the EJ25 that's in the STI right now. You know, the R8 engine.
Yeah.
And
well,
so,
there's a lot
but they have their limitations too.
And there's a lot of kit cars that are now using K series engines. Like, man, when Romain Dumas won Pikes Peak Hill Climb the first time with that, I think it was a Norma chassis that were running a turbo K series. I think Robin Shute is still running a turbo K series in that car that he's won twice with. And so I mean,
Ariel Adams came with them from the factory like that.
Yeah. There's so many power potentials, and then there's so many applications where, like for racing, where that K series is just really kind of fit the bill and been used. It's got some.
They're really tall. They're really tall engines, and so I mean, people talk about. I've had so many people tell me to put a K inside my Subarus for years.
Yeah.
But they're super tall and really long. I mean, as far as compared to an EJ, but I mean, it's almost. I don't know that guy with the K series, that Boosted Boys kid. I mean, that the hood doesn't even fit on that thing, right?
Right.
Like, so I mean, it's just stuff like that's really not that practical.
And I think Betabuilt is doing one as well now. Yeah. So like, there's a couple of people that have kind of gone down that road.
Yeah, but I don't know. There was I did see a little GC that's doing a K24 in it, and they have the engine, half the valve covers under the dash, so they had like pushed it way back, dropped it really low. I mean, with the dry sump, it would take some weight, take some low end clearance issues out of it, but I have no idea what kind of drivetrain is going to be in that thing.
Yeah,
it could be rear-wheel drive for all I know.
Yeah.
Have you guys had any experience with some of the Subaru engine parts that are in, I forget what they're called, the Gymkhana cars nowadays, the Vermont sports car, like whether it's the wagon one or
are you talking about the billet blocks?
Family.
Yeah. So Vermont sports cars making those billet heads and stuff like that nowadays with all sorts of fancy things.
No, it's a company out of Australia.
Crest.
Yeah.
Whatever.
So they can't sell their billet head version, but they are making a cast version now, or they're going to, right?
Yeah.
The same head design where they changed the way the exhaust porting's made.
Yeah.
They changed the way that the coolant rests to the head, changed the intake style and stuff. I mean, made a lot of changes. They look really awkward to me, but.
Well, but maybe it fixed some of the problems. Like getting rid of the dogleg exhaust port is really interesting. I'm wondering why Subaru never did that, and I'm guessing it's just from a packaging standpoint. They wanted the exhaust manifold on each side to attach as closely as possible.
Yeah.
Versus having like two completely separate flanges or something. I don't know what the rationale.
I mean, when you look at the flange bolt pattern on that Crest head, it's basically 4 bolts hold down each outgoing exhaust port. 8 bolts versus 3 bolts. I mean, so I mean, there's a lot going in those things. And I mean, you got guys like Dewey. I was talking with Dewey about it at PRI, and he was like, dude, I'm going to get those as soon as I can and blah, blah, blah. And I think they'll be cool. But I think I try and remind everybody that I talk to about Subarus is that Subarus are like there's such a unique platform. They're way more than just the engine. And I think a lot of people get really focused on the engine in those cars when, I mean, they've got symmetrical drive shafts. They got fancy center differentials that can be tuned and programmed. You can put differentials everywhere. Like all the stuff that the Subarus can really do. I mean, really eclipse the engine. Like the engine is just, probably more of a packaging offering or packaging issue than it is more of this is the crown jewel of these cars. And I think a lot of people make a big focus on it. I think
it's
about
the whole package.
Exactly. I think about what's gonna, like with Dewey's car, like what's the extra power gonna do for you if you're focused so much on that,
Yeah.
But I've really focused a lot on the chassis side, in the suspension side, because it's the cheapest. I don't know about the cheapest, but it's the most reliable side of the car you can focus on, you know? So,
and once you get it to work right, man, I mean, you just have such good performance out of these cars, such good cornering ability, the ability to maintain speed through the track. I think one of the pitfalls that people fall into is they look at, like, okay, well, this Corvette that I'm racing against, he's making 800 horsepower, so I need to make 800 horsepower. Like, you look at the power that other cars are making, and you just think that there's a direct correlation. And Subarus, just for whatever reason, they tend to hit it well above their power number as far as the lap times that they're able to put down. So, like, if you get, go ahead.
Well, yeah, that struck me one time. I got the opportunity to drive R8, Audi R8, like the mid-engine V10 thing, whatever. And what struck me, and it was just a canyon run. It wasn't anything like on a track or something like that, but enough to, take it through the paces a little bit. And what struck me was that car did not handle any better than my, junk ass hood rat race car Subaru. Right. Like it was cool that it could handle as well as my Subaru, and then you push some buttons and it turned back into an Audi, and you could tour across the country at 90 miles an hour listening to classical music and sipping champagne. So it was cool that it could go do that stuff also. But it didn't handle any better than my Subaru did. And it cost 400 million times what my Subaru cost. Right. Yeah. Like, I mean, not quite. Those are approximations. And also, you shouldn't
300 million.
Shouldn't drink and drive either, whatever, right? But what I'm trying to say here, right? Like it's, and
I think
because we gotta always bring it back to rally racing, because rally is the heart of all motorsport and the pinnacle of motorsport and what Subarus are made for.
Yep.
You weird track guys.
But it's been established. Dirt's for racing.
Look at current crop of WRC cars. There's a lot of optimization done to, the McPherson strut suspension kind of stuff. But it's essentially still the same basic suspension design as Subarus had 30 years ago, right?
Yeah. And let's talk about this. So you won your first Colorado Hill Climb overall this year, 2022. What was the second place car?
What was it?
It was Spencer Steele.
Oh yeah, that's right. It was an open wheel Wells Coyote, methanol V8, whatever.
So a V8 running methanol, rough power. Any idea?
He says it's not 1,000 horsepower. I think it drives like 1,000. I think it's probably close to 700 and some. But it also weighs like 1,500 pounds.
Well, but that even then, so like let's say it's 700 horsepower and a 1,500 pound chassis.
Right.
And your car that you beat him, it's all-wheel drive versus rear wheel. Yes, but you're making how much horsepower?
Half as much horsepower, twice as heavy. Yeah. And beat him on a 2-minute course. It beat him by like 5 seconds.
Yeah. So I think that the key recipe for success to me for people that are running Subarus, and especially that run Subarus for like multiple seasons or any length of time, I think, is that you look at your lap times and you look for how much lap time you have to gain, and you look at the whole car and the system of the car, and you figure out, okay, where in this whole system do I need to make improvements to bring my lap time down? And those are the guys that are successful. If you come into it and you just say, well, I'm going up against an 800 horsepower methanol V8, I need to make 800 horsepower. Those are the guys that usually struggle more, because like it's way more challenging to get a Subaru to make that much power reliably. And if you miss looking at the whole chassis and all of the other details, that like the braking system, optimizing the suspension geometry, all of those other things, if you miss all of that, then you're never going to extract the full performance that you think you should get from that power number. And then you just
not that power is not important. And I do think that Subarus are catching up in the reliable, which is weird that they're catching up now with a now discontinued motor. And we're just now catching up to all these things, which is, it's a 30-year-old engine design. And we're just now coming around to making 700 horsepower in a reliable motorsport application, with like those Gymkhana cars and stuff. But, power is still important. Yes. But the Subarus are so good in so many ways, like that High Plains track time that's still on the board there. I haven't been to High Plains in years.
Mm-hmm.
That track time was set. That was it 202 or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. Which is, but that was set on stock STI suspension with a off-the-shelf lowering spring on a stock Spec C turbo, but not like a big fancy big horsepower turbo. And that car was making 260 horsepower at that time. It didn't have an interior in it, but it wasn't crazy super lightweight. It had no aero. It was on junk ass old tires and off-the-shelf wheels with
old tires,
4-pot 2-pot brakes, right? So these are all like really, in the motorsport world, really cheap off-the-shelf Subaru parts, not really all that modified and stuff in it. And the car was able to put down that 202, right? The first championship I went to Hill Climbs was on stock STI suspension, full stop, like stock STI struts and springs, stock STI. I think that was even a 2-liter with a TD04 on that one. So, I mean, the rest of the car of a Subaru is really like you don't think of it, you don't look twice at it because it's just the chassis, but the chassis on a Subaru is really good. It's
the base potential is so high.
It's not like it was a street car that was built to be an okay rally car. When they made the GCs, those were ProDrive's ultimate expression of what a rally car could be at that point. And then they said to themselves, this could be a little bit better. Subaru, do you mind making us an even better shell to work with? And Subaru was like, yeah, sick. Sounds good. They made the GDs, and they optimized chassis stiffness on a production car just to make it a better rally car.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's a wild part of the history of Subarus that gets forgotten so much when, the culture nowadays is highway pulls down I-25 at 2 a.m. You forget that these chassis that we're talking about were made for motorsports and then adapted for the street, and then a handful of other stuff, right? Like that air to water, that oil to water cooler we're talking about. That's really kind of there for like consistent tuning and emissions, and these are all things that they bopped onto stuff to make it an okay street car.
I think for a street car, it improves the reliability, I think. I mean, that's why the STIs have always had them. Yeah.
Well, right. It makes them more consistent.
2008.
It makes them more consistent, just like having a heated throttle body, right? It makes the tune easier to tune, to have a nice, consistent, safe tune for all that stuff, which is why they ran heated throttle bodies in those. I mean, the oil cooler on those cars, I think you have a different opinion than me on it, but my opinion is they're there as an oil heater to help keep the, for people that don't want to warm their car up, they want to get the oil temp up to temp faster. So they use coolant temp, which responds quicker to engine stuff, right?
Yep.
So,
and over the life of a car, if you live in Colorado where you have summer and winter, like if you're going to have a more consistent oil temperature through the whole course of the seasons, then that reduces wear.
Right. But so a lot of these things that we find as failure points on these Subarus, tying it all back to the donut media thing, they are the compromises that Subaru made in order to take a motorsports car and make it streetable. So when we take these street components and turn them back into motorsports components, then we have these wild, unstoppable motorsports platforms because the bones are there from the start. Like the chassis are amazing. The suspension design, people, and I know like the asphalt world doesn't like the McPherson strut nearly as much as like dual wishbone stuff, but it is a really good design most of the time for the rally side of things. You can get a lot of travel out of them. They're really robust.
And if you correct the geometry, you can still get a lot of good performance out of them on tarmac. Like is multi-link better? Yes, you have more control, but if you set a McPherson up right, they're no slouch either.
And it shows that the top level of rally cars are still running McPherson style suspension, right? And these cars are tube chassis, ultimate unlimited cars essentially nowadays, right? And they're still like, we'll optimize. And they do funny things like kick the shocks over sideways to help get more length and all sorts of optimized things. And arms are crazy dimensions and stuff, but it's still McPherson. Yeah. And Subaru had those way back to the 80s, right? Yeah. Like, I don't know. That's my rant here is about how good that, like, it's really dovetailing off your thing, Ryan, about, there's a lot of parts of a Subaru, like the drivetrain, are just really good. Like it's something you take for granted.
And it's like ironically, to bring it back to Donut, one of the comments that they made, and in fact, I heard it again when we were going back through it this morning, getting ready for this, is that the time that I think it's at this point, the low car put down at Willow Springs is the fastest of any of the high-low cars that they've done so far.
Yeah.
It's actually
on stock power.
Yeah, there's still this huge potential in the chassis, and I think that's what keeps people like us excited about it, because we know that the potential is there, but then it also is what still helps draw people into the chassis, because they find out or hear about the potential that's there. They know that this is a car that can hit above its power, and it's just, figuring out how to do that, or what the best way to approach that is.
It will be until they break the transmissions, because they're launching the shit out of those 5-speeds.
Yeah.
And like 400 horsepower on one of those. Oh man.
Yeah, it's just kind of another part where they're kind of setting themselves up for another failure point, I guess.
But even then, when I was running 5-speeds, I would take the teeth off of a mid-range gear somewhere, usually like third gear, but they generally held up. I mean, I would fry synchros, sure, whatever, but I'm not looking for like sweet like coffee run shifts that are super smooth and quiet, so that doesn't really matter. So I would take teeth off a trip, but like the famous glass second gear was resolved at like the end of 03, right?
Halfway through, but
so it's the 5-speed's still pretty good. I mean, you run into on a loose surface the limit of the viscous center diff and stuff like that. Like it's common in the rally world. Either you got to replace it, spool it, 6-speed swap it, or the factory center viscous limited slip is going to overheat, and then you get the telltale discoloring, and then they become ineffective, and you're essentially open diff in the center. I don't know how that holds up to the asphalt world of stuff, but
there's not as much spin, so that they don't wear as quickly.
But they're pretty light transmissions. They could be stronger, but for a factory power level, I wouldn't hesitate to track a 5. I mean, I think the 6-speeds are better in every way other than weight.
Still have a 5-speed.
Still have a 6-speed.
I have a 6-speed too. I just haven't put it in yet.
But at stock power, sure. A 400 wheel, even I don't think so. I don't think that car's gonna. The high car is gonna break more.
Well,
I would guess
they're both stock 5-speeds, but
I would guess that they probably have already removed some teeth from the rear diff spiders. I would guess if they pop those rear diffs open, there'd be some spider gear teeth floating around in that fluid. Because that was a common thing I saw running the R160s with the viscous limited slips are just 2 pinion spiders. And so that's very little area for that power to transfer through. So even like I ended up running a GC STI clutch type limited slip when I had a R160 still, because that had 4 spider gears. So that was twice as much area to transfer the power through. But I would guess that just with the launches they've done, they'd probably already have some teeth missing in those rear diffs. So.
Boy, well, we'll have to see what else happens, but we've talked a lot about this, so I think we should probably wrap this episode up. Are there any other key things or other things you guys want to hit on before we wrap?
I mean, I think it's important that anybody we talked about it, anybody who has an engine failure really needs to consider all the components that are in it. People should be paying attention to what their cars are doing when they're getting them out on track the first time. I always tell people who are new in my SCCA region, especially in Subarus or anything force induction, check your oil after every session before you go back out, because you just don't know what you don't know. We've seen the PCV potential of PCV issues, but with a stock PCV system, they can run flawlessly. So, I mean, everything doesn't have to have 12 mil pumps and AOSs and cylinder 4 cooling mods and all that. Everybody's got an opinion on it. It was cool to see how many people were in the comments trying to support it.
Yeah, and even more, if you have all of those things, but you're not paying attention to the engine, you could just be as liable to have this kind of failure with all those parts as if you didn't have any of them, but you were paying close attention to everything, all the information that you could get out of the car after each track session. It's the process. The process is greater than the parts. Like finding out what the process is going to the track and what to do with the car. That's more important than the parts on the car necessarily, because you're going to catch stuff as it's happening.
Yeah, and I think they're doing a great video series. I think that's fair.
It is entertaining to watch.
Yeah, it's at the end of the day, they're having fun in Subarus. They're going through stuff that we all learned.
Yeah.
At some point, they're a good channel.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. I mean, it's easy to get frustrated with some of these big channels. Like I was saying earlier, when they simplify stuff or they're making expensive, big mistakes that seem like beginner issues to someone else. It's easy to get frustrated with these folks, but they're all just humans, going through their process and having fun with sweet ass cars. So that's rad. They do a good product, so.
Yeah, it's entertaining to watch. And I think their heart's in the right place for the information that they're trying to put out there, like in comparing expensive components versus cheap components. Where do you get a value for the top dollar components versus where can you actually save money? I mean, there's a good idea there. Yeah.
That being
what's
said,
crazy to me, I'd like to, with all the stuff that they have to actually do testing, like when they were doing the shock dyno stuff, you could really optimize some of the aspects of those cars for pretty cheap. I was thinking about those cheap $300 coilovers, and they're on the same spring rates as the Tanes. You could put the spring rates that are supposed to be with that valving, and I bet that'd make the car handle even better. Like, not because those are crap coilovers and need higher spring rates, but because the spring rates that are on common off-the-shelf shocks or coilover kits are already too soft for track application anyway. So it was like the amount of stuff that they actually have at their, like, if I had a shock dyno like that and I could dyno all my stuff and optimize shit, you could do a lot more with a lot cheaper parts. And I think that low car is already showing, like, the perception of a high quality part isn't necessarily true, but the perception of a low quality car might not be true either. Does that make sense? So it's pretty interesting. I mean, the low car is really not far off the pace of the high car with a big difference in price.
Yeah. It's gonna be interesting to see how it plays out. And that's kind of the game that we play ourselves. That's what we've just been talking about a bit. Yeah.
Yeah. At the end of the day, all of our cars are cheap cars.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, they're expensive, cheap cars, but we're always looking to take that low car attitude with everything we do, because we don't have that unlimited budget.
Spend the money wisely. Absolutely. Yep.
What size Garrett was that they put on there?
I don't know, huh?
It looked like GT30 size at least.
No, I bet
I'm guessing it made 400 wheel.
It's probably like
a 28.
It's a G25 or probably something in the 30R.
Family, I didn't think it's a G series. I figured it's a GTX.
Yeah, I'd say like a 3071, 3076, something like that.
Yeah, which is going to be, I mean, a TD05, what is it, 19 or whatever they put on there?
20G on the
20. Yeah, so it's they're comparing apples to oranges, not just expensive turbo, cheap turbo.
Yeah. They're not it's not like a 30R version of like a Max Peating Rod turbo against a 30R version of a Garrett turbo.
Right.
And I think you would see more of a longevity issue more than you would see a power issue initially.
Yeah.
It's going to be that will be the interesting thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
If they're pushing so hard, they have more reliability issues on the high car because they're making more power.
Right.
And they're pushing harder.
80 horsepower.
Yeah. Difference between turbos is a big difference. It's not just a price thing. So it's and there's a handful of things that have been that way, but that's almost be a more interesting thing, like you were saying, with access to the resources that they have available to them. It would be rad to see optimized cheap shit versus off the shelf expensive stuff, right? Like
right.
So, get the universal whatever suspension and optimize it and set it up versus just unpacking a set of whatever your top level tarmac shit is. And just putting it on there out of the box without adjusting it or any kind of adjustment, spring rate, spring purchase even, right? And all that kind of stuff and do that would be interesting too.
That seems like something maybe that is at least more attainable that we could try.
Optimize cheap shit?
optimized cheap shit.
It would look like this guy and this guy over here and that guy over there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was the most enamored by the max speeding rods for as cheap as they were. The fact that you could dyno it and see each curve of each click, right? And know, I mean, obviously some of these things are just way out of there, but you know which each one of those is, and then you can know what spring rate will be ideal for it. I mean, you really could be like, all right, these middle 5 clicks are the ones we got to use. All the rest of them are trash. And then now we got these spring. I mean, it really would be. You really could probably do a lot more with that than some off-the-shelf taints. Like, I really do think so.
Yep. Yeah, especially if we did the math on like spring resonance and all that kind of all that fun deep dive stuff that you could do. So I have a set sitting out in the wind and snow right now. If you want, I'll sell them to you cheap. If you,
they're already cheap. You'll buy them brand new for cheap.
Cheaper.
Buy them straight from Alibaba.
Oh man.
Yeah, you can get these straight from Tasso Baba.
Tasso Baba.
Tasso Baba.
You should trademark that.
Whatever,
man. All right. Well, I think we've talked about this subject. Unless they do something completely spectacular, I think we will just let Donut Media go off and do their thing as it might be. But definitely wanted to have a chat about it. But I think it ended up being a really good conversation about all things Subaru from top to bottom. So thank you guys. Appreciate it. Thanks to you guys for listening. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your support as always. And until next time, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Flatirons Syndicate Motorsports Podcast. Once again, we'd like to let you know that your support is what makes this show possible. Be sure to check out our online store at flatirons.com for any of your aftermarket or OEM Subaru parts needs. And as always, stay tuned with Flatirons Tuning.